Hey crafty friends, it's Juliana. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy you're here. In this video, I have some fun techniques to share with you using the new Tim Holtz embossing glazes. If you aren't familiar with embossing glazes, they're really similar to embossing powders in that you pour them over an embossing ink or a sticky type ink, and then you use a heat tool to melt the powder. The big difference here, though, is that these embossing glazes are translucent, so you can see through them, and then when you layer them, they can create a lot of cool depth, dimension, and texture to your projects. These fun techniques and the cards I created using them are coming up next. On this first card, I'm using the embossing glazes with distressed translucent texture paste and stencils to create some great texture and design. To get started, I used one of the script stamps from the Tim Holtz Ledger script stamp set. I'm inking it up with frayed burlap archival ink and using my Misty stamping tool to stamp the image onto a piece of distressed watercolor paper. I found this paper didn't warp as much when using the combination of mediums that I'm using for this technique. Once the background image was stamped, I applied distressed translucent texture paste through the Tim Holtz mosaic stencil using a palette knife. I applied a bit to the top left corner and then moved the stencil down and over to apply some to the bottom right corner. Because this paste is translucent, it will allow the stamping in the background to show through after this next step. If you use the regular texture paste, you won't be able to see the background stamping in the area where the paste was applied. Next, I selected the picked raspberry, wild honey, and candied apple embossing glazes and began applying them to sections of the texture paste while it was still wet. I used my fingers to pinch a bit of the glaze and then sprinkled it over the various areas of the paste. Once the entire area was covered with the glazes, I tapped off the excess and then grabbed my heat gun to melt the embossing glaze. You will notice the paste will kind of bubble as it's being heated. Just make sure to keep your heat gun moving and don't leave it in one spot for too long. Keep moving it over the entire surface until all of the embossing glaze powder is melted and becomes shiny. I absolutely love the texture, depth, dimension, and shine that this technique achieves. Here is another version of this technique using the Tim Holtz Lattice Work Stencil. The embossing glazes I used on this card are Wilted Violet, Salty Ocean, and Twisted Citron. Now on to my second card. Once again, I'm using embossing glazes. This time I layered them with archival ink to create a beautiful rainbow background. To get started, I selected this dot stamp from the Tim Holtz Grunged stamp set. I'm going to ink it with each of the new Tim Holtz mini archival inks to create a rainbow background. I began with Rustic Wilderness and stamped it onto a piece of distressed watercolor paper. Once again, I found this paper to warp less than when I tried this same technique on distressed heavy stock. After stamping the image in each color, I cleaned the stamp using Ranger Archival ink cleaner and then wiped it off with a rag. I found that if I didn't do this, that the previous color left on the stamp muddied up the next color I applied since the ink was still wet. So I took the time to clean the stamp in between stamping each image. I repeated the stamping, moving the image down the paper using each of the mini archival ink colors, going in a modified rainbow order. I began with Rustic Wilderness, then Prize Ribbon, Villainous Potion, Picked Raspberry, which is from the original archival ink release, Fired Brick, and Crackling Campfire. Once the stamping was completed, it was time to add the embossing glaze. Prior to creating this background, I did some experimenting to determine which ink colors would show up best under each of the glaze colors. With the stamping completed, it was time to begin adding the embossing glazes. I used the Distress Embossing Dabber to apply embossing ink over each of the various colors. I wiped the dabber over one section at a time and sprinkled it with the selected embossing glaze. I used the following colors in this order: Twisted Citron, Salty Ocean, wilted violet, picked raspberry, candied apple, and wild honey. I also allowed the ink to overlap at times, and I love how the embossing glazes created a new color when they overlapped. For the embellishments on all of the cards I'm sharing today, I die cut a butterfly from distress watercolor paper using one of the dies from the Tim Holtz detailed butterfly thinlits. I applied embossing ink to the die cut using the Tim Holtz embossing dabber. I sprinkled it with hickory smoke embossing glaze and heat set it using my heat gun. You'll notice that I repeat this step because I wanted the color to be a little darker, so I applied another layer of the ink, added more glaze, and reheated it. I just love the interest this added to the die cut as compared to just die cutting it from black or dark gray cardstock. I hope you enjoyed learning these fun techniques using the new Distress Embossing Glazes and Archival inks. All the supplies I used here can be found below in the description box. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.